Welcome back to the Road to Resilience podcast, where we explore the people, ideas, and strategies shaping stronger, safer, and more resilient communities. I'm John Ray, your co host. And for those new to the podcast, I'm the principal and founder of Florida Resilience Group consulting firm. I'm joined today by my co host, Ashley Harrigan. She's the principal and founder for Fairwinds Resilience Consulting Firm. Today, we're diving into a topic that impacts every community, every sector, and every future decision we make. That's climate resilience. Climate resilience is no longer a future conversation. It's a leadership imperative happening right now. I'm excited for today's conversation with Benjamin DeAngelo, principal and founder of Operation Future LLC. Benjamin brings a powerful perspective to the intersection of strategy, sustainability, preparedness, and long-term resilience planning. His work helps organizations move beyond simply reacting to crises toward building systems that can withstand disruption before it happens. Benjamin, welcome to the Road to Resilience podcast. We're glad to have you with us.
John, thank you. John, Ashley, great to be here.
Glad to have you on the show. And so I want to just give our listeners a little bit of your background and bio before we get started. Um, Benjamin DeAngelo is an experienced leader bridging climate science with climate mitigation and adaptation actions. He has over 27 years of experience in the U.S. federal government. He's led and initiated domestic and international policy actions and research assessments over his time in the federal service. And then since departing the federal government last year, he founded Operation Future LLC, and it's formed partnerships with Earth Knowledge Inc. and Silverstrom Climate Associates. And he is now also an adjunct professor at Howard University, here local, at least to me and him, in Washington, D.C. And so it really shows that one, he's pretty busy. So we thank him for sort of being on and recording with us, but really has a breadth and depth of experience in terms of talking to a lot of different communities. So we are really glad to have you on the show, and hopefully it will be a great conversation. So, how would you define resilience? It's always something that we like to ground all of our conversations with.
Thanks, Ashley. It's a great place to start. It's um, it's a good question because though textbook definitions exist of resilience, there really is no standard definition. I find in a real world, on the ground sense, and there is no standard metric for resilience, which may not be a fatal flaw, but it can be challenging. Um, the the textbook definition that you can find in a glossary of, say, the IPCC report or last National Climate Assessment is basically, the ability to cope with the changing climate and be able to maintain the functioning of, say, human or natural system, or recover the functioning of that system after, say, the shock or some aspect of climate change. So resilience, I think, is more a state of being that is a state of being able to cope, deal, recover from, and maybe even in special circumstances to thrive in the face of a changing climate. And an adaptation refers to actions that lead to a better state of resilience. Now, something I've been thinking about a lot is, how do you know whether something, a community, a facility, a supply chain, an ecosystem, how do you know it's resilient or becoming resilient even after adaptation actions have taken place? We don't necessarily know it when we see it, and we can't always measure it like we can, say, at the greenhouse gas emission mitigation world, where we can measure, say, the amount of tons that we reduce. But but we do know what kinds of things can be done in all different sectors, regions, and contexts that help reduce the risks of extreme weather events and the risks of longer term changes. And kind of the last point that I've been thinking about more recently is that, because the climate is no longer stationary. Obviously, it's changing. It's changing rapidly, and will continue to do so. So, likewise, the state of resilience should not be thought of as a static state. Are we resilient? Yes or no? It really means that keeping people, communities, um, infrastructure, our economies resilient also means evolving and adapting over time, basically to stay on top of and ahead of changes that are happening.
Ben, that's a great answer. Probably one of the best answers I've heard since we've been recording the podcast. And to your point, I always point out that two of the main pillars for resilience is adaptation and transformation, and that kind of talks to why there really isn't a destination. I always think of resilience as if you have the road resilience boat and you go on a voyage, it's kind of an uncharted destination, right? Because you're never going to arrive there. And I know we try to measure it in a lot of different ways. I've tried to measure it throughout my career. I've developed risk and resilience assessments for facilities and organizations, and you're right, it's a moving target, and it's intended to be that way. But I really love that response. Thank you.
Yeah, how do you know you're there when you're there? And what is the target?
Exactly, exactly. Well, with that said, we have Earth Month and DC Climate Week happening simultaneously. So, what does this moment represent for you as someone who's worked at the intersection of environment, policy, and community, Ben?
Well, one I think it's great that DC and other cities are having their own climate weeks, following New York City's lead. I think. Well, I'm not sure. I think New York City was the first to have a climate week. Um, and to me, it's a clear demonstration that the federal government does not have to be the center of the universe when it comes to taking actions to address changing climate and environmental conditions. And of course, I spent so much time in the federal government over 27 years. When one can start to form the impression that so much does or should depend on the federal government. But DC Climate Week and the activities happening around it are really, I find it very hopeful and empowering that there are events like this, and generates a lot of interest, participation, and you see people again outside the federal government working on all different angles of climate issues. So, from rethinking national level policies to, very concrete on the ground measures like reducing, say, the urban heat island effect, even at the neighborhood level to improve quality of life, and to talk about, where um, for specific places, for even neighborhoods within a city, where greater investment is needed.
Yeah, that's a great point. And before I came to local government, I didn't realize, how much work is actually being done at the ground level. Just here in the city of Fort Worth, they have an extraordinary stormwater team that has some really impressive mitigation projects that they're working on here. They're probably one of the best groups in the whole state of Texas. But I'm very impressed with the work that's being done at the local level.
I think it's also been sort of eye-opening for me too. I I recognize that all three of us here are coming from at least some level of federal government experience, and it is easy, then to your point, to think that that's where the center of gravity is in terms of some of this policy. But it's really inspiring to see that people who may not have a certain comfort level with the federal government being in charge or in the driver's seat has been able to, jump in and have different ideas and engagements that actually get people engaged who may not be engaged at the federal level, but are definitely engaged at the local level. And there's so much more creativity and, engagement and inspiration that's going on there. It's great to see.
Yeah, I'm learning day by day that there's a big world outside the federal government, and to the extent that there are going to be other um, ex-federal employees listening to this. I'm sure they're finding the same thing, and one, it can be daunting because it can mean you have a lot to learn, especially if you're like me and you've spent basically an entire career inside the federal government. You find that outside, it's like, oh, things work differently. There are different levers of influence, and so it's challenging, it's daunting, but I also find it frankly, very liberating to be outside of federal government and to suddenly have a lot more, degrees of freedom to think kind of creatively and to think about, working with people who you really want to work with and pursue the kind of things you want to pursue.
Yeah, especially when you talk about planning. And I do think you're right. It's an amazing moment that we're living in right now to see that new communities are kind of being built. And we are becoming parts of new communities too. Shift and sort of talk about another community, which is students, because you are also a professor too. Um, I remember you talking to me about how students would be developing climate action plans. And I really love the idea because it forces sort of ordinary people or people who are not sort of very traditional policy people and policy trained people to think about policy, especially in terms of policy that shapes our world. And so I'm kind of curious, one, if there's any feedback from that now, but what do you think is generally important components of climate action plans, and what would you want this audience to know?
Yeah, very happy to talk about that. I'm now wrapping up my first ever university class. I've been teaching just this past semester at Howard University here in Washington D.C. I've been teaching an undergraduate class titled Global Climate Change, and I'm doing it as an adjunct. And yes, as their last assignment, I had them do a group project to pick a state and then present a climate assessment for that state. And really, this was a way of bringing together all the things we talked about throughout the course. Historic and projected climate change for that state, the key impacts and risks for public health and different sectors of that state, the key greenhouse gas emission mitigation options, and key adaptation strategies to address the risks that are identified in the state. And this basically follows the model of the national climate assessment at the federal level that I've been very involved in throughout the years. By the way, just as an aside, though it is mandated by Congress, there appears to be nothing happening right now on the sixth national climate assessment, which is supposed to be due in 2027, as far as I could tell. But in terms of what makes for a good assessment, whether it be at the national level or the state level, one, it should serve as an authoritative, credible source of information for all actors who want to use information about our changing climate for that state or for the nation, for their decision making. And it should be clear about what climatic changes have been observed in the region, and it should be clear about what future changes are anticipated over the coming decades. And that also includes being clear about what is known and what remains uncertain. Transparency about what we know and what we don't know is very important for science communication and scientific integrity. It should identify all the off-the-shelf and potential future measures that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions for that region, and identify a set of adaptation measures that would make sense in that region to reduce the risks. Um, Now, whether it's at the state level or national level, um, a climate assessment, even a really, really good one, can't necessarily answer everyone's question about their specific location or their specific economic sector, but it can provide the basic foundational knowledge base from which more tailored and fit for purpose information can be added. So, you can take a national climate assessment as a foundational building block and then kind of layer on top of that your own fit for purpose analysis. So my Howard students put together really good and succinct assessments for key states, and I'm actually still in the middle of grading them. I have to finish that this week. And they did this exactly along the lines that I just talked about, but they certainly did highlight where underserved communities are especially vulnerable to climate risks, and in some cases how those same areas overlap with where there are kind of non climate environmental burdens like poor air quality due to, say, proximity to heavy industry or heavy transportation corridors. So it's been I think it was a good exercise, and I think it was a good way of, reinforcing for them, what does make a good assessment? What do we mean? What do we mean by assessment? And I also think it was a good way for them to um, uh, pull many strands together of what we talked about and what they learned throughout the course.
I can just hear all of the people who are Howard listeners doing the HU. Um, being really proud that this work is being done at especially the undergrad level, thinking about that. That's such an advanced way to start thinking about climate adaptation and climate action planning. It's really
Yeah.
cool.
And Ben, I wanted to add and give me the short answer, right? So I don't want to hold us up here, but for our listeners, I've dabbled a bit. I'm not an expert in climate resilience, but I've dabbled a bit in climate adaptation planning. But can you explain for the listeners just really quick what the difference between climate and weather is?
Um, sure. Weather is, weather, everyone is very familiar with weather. Weather is what happens on very, very short timescales. Even like, hourly, daily, this week, next week, what is happening at the moment. Uh, Climate is essentially average weather conditions over longer timescales. Um, in in the scientific community, 30 years is typically used as the time frame over which climate conditions are defined. So you need kind of 30 years of a trend, 30 years of data before you can say something about the average climate conditions for that region or whether or not you have a climate trend. So it's a function of time frame, and greenhouse gases come into play for climate because greenhouse gases affect conditions over long time frames. Greenhouse gas emissions don't necessarily change, weather patterns from 1 hour to the next.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you for that. We had an expert on today, so I wanted to make sure that I asked that question for our listener. Appreciate it.
I
Who's
can tell
actually
he's an expert
actually
because he did it quick.
and my students got essentially the same kind of um, definitions like on day one.
Um, so you've worked inside EPA and NOAA, two agencies that are central to environmental protection and climate science. What lessons from that federal experience show up in your community work today?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the first thing that um, comes to mind here is that, since I am no longer in federal government, and I've been outside of federal government now for still less than a year, about 9 months or so. But in that time, I really have gained a new perspective on the value of the information that agencies like NOAA and EPA had been producing on climate. Things like the Fifth National Climate Assessment and the EPA greenhouse gas emissions inventory are just incredibly valuable, and for some communities, really indispensable source materials, kind of standard reference materials, that are viewed as authoritative, credible. And I've used these kind of sources repeatedly in my class at Howard, and so um, I I will I will say, it's just reality. It it does pain me to see that, we're still all of us are still paying our federal taxes. Um, but in the climate space, we're no longer getting many of the updates from basic data sources that a lot of people have been using and want to use for decision making. So, NOAA, for example, is no longer updating its database of billion-dollar disasters associated with extreme weather and climate events. That database had been showing an unambiguous increase in the number of these disasters and associated economic costs. EPA is no longer updating just the basic bread and butter information of greenhouse gas emissions for the United States. And that's something we've done every year since the early 1990s, and every other country um, continues to do that. And as I mentioned before, in the process to produce the updated National Climate Assessment is basically not happening from what I can tell. But thankfully, groups outside the federal government are taking the initiative to continue a lot of these data sets. So again, it's just very important that people and communities at the local level have authoritative, actionable information available to them, that um, they can trust. um, and local actors, you know, don't have and shouldn't be expected to have the capacity, to build their own foundational climate data sets and climate information systems. They shouldn't have to, and they shouldn't have to go through a lengthy process to figure out um, what what data can be trusted. These should be widely available and easy to use. So it it's uh, yeah, sorry that it's a bit of a negative of story, but 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 it is something that um hits me hard now that I'm outside of federal government, and now that I see some of these key data sources no longer being made available, because I see more clearly now how valuable they can be to people outside the federal government.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is a bad news story, but it's a news story that needs to be told nonetheless. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. I mean, it's just added more complexity in already a complex world when it comes to climate resilience. Um, with that said, we were just talking about Earth Day moments ago, and Earth Day often encourages people to think green, right, at the neighborhood level. So, from your vantage point, then what's one local action that actually strengthens community resilience?
Just one? Well, I do think, I do think one answer is on the governance side. So I think it's hugely important at the community level to have a multi-stakeholder plan involving, not just local government, but local private industry, any local academic resources, private investors, local financial institutions. It's important that the key climate risks be identified and widely understood, and that there be mechanisms in place to get resources towards those activities that give you resilience. So one thing is kind of to have a plan, um, um, a resilience plan in place. Um, but if I could point to, one or maybe two, specific actions, like very, very specific actions, I immediately think of, solar and trees. So, ramping up solar, can provide multiple benefits, including, of course, reduced emissions, but also, lower energy bills, and therefore that can contribute to affordable housing, can also enhance resilience when there's energy storage, where energy continues to get provided, even if there's a grid failure from some event or extreme weather event. And we do need to make more progress on long-term energy storage in order to help solar expand even more. And though solar costs have come down like 90% in recent decades, the upfront installation costs are still high and represent a barrier to adoption. But that's where public and private financing can come in and assist with those upfront costs. Um, and tree planting provides multiple benefits as well. Creating more shade to reduce the urban heat island effect. And we have data for a number of cities, including here in Washington, D.C., showing that lower income neighborhoods also tend to be those it's experiencing the highest temperatures on the hottest days. And, the shade lowers temperatures and also reduces the energy needed to cool homes and buildings. And trees also just enhance quality of life. And these things are very, very doable, very tangible things that I think everyone can relate to and make the case for doing these things. And we don't at this we're at the point where we don't really need any fancy climate assessment to tell us that these are really good things to do for multiple reasons.
Absolutely.
I love those ideas, and it kind of reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. I can't remember where it's from, but it's like, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." Um,
That's absolutely right.
yeah, and so it's never not a bad time to do something that betters the community for all of the reasons that you described. I think that's a great, like, tangible thing, and I think it's something that everybody of all ages can get involved with at a community level. I
Mhm.
remember doing that as a kid and as an adult, so.
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to sort of transition. We've had guests before, and of course, we've talked about a bunch of different, areas of resilience, and you've touched on it a little bit. But I did just want to ask, how is moving from public service and, all of the time that we've been discussing about working in the federal government to being a community business owner and a professor, what has that taught you about resilience, either, personally or, community resilience?
It's a great question. So, this time for me is definitely a transition and frankly still a learning curve. For me, given the length of time I spent in the federal government, and first I just wanted to just describe what for me what adaptation and resilience was within the federal government, because that's the place I'm kind of coming from and learning how to translate my federal experience into something that is more kind of targeted towards services that people want, especially at a local or subnational level. And for me, resilience within the federal government, it was essentially in three areas. I mean, one was analyses, and that was basically to ensure we had analytic capabilities to model and quantify the benefits of adaptation options. I was involved in EPA's early work to quantify the avoided damages as a result of mitigation and adaptation options, and much of this work then got featured prominently within the National Climate Assessment. And these were typically national scale analyses, so not for individual communities. The second was funding. So, while I was at NOAA, especially, we had a number of grant programs that went to communities and institutions to build capacity for adaptation and resilience. So, I was at the program level, um, not a recipient of these grants at the community level. And the third thing was an initiative that kind of came in fits and starts um, over my time in federal government, and that was to create climate services, and that's basically the notion of creating climate information tools and pipelines of information to all kinds of actors outside the federal government so that they could use climate information and apply it to their particular situation or region to, assess their own climate risks and then therefore make well-informed decisions about adaptation and resilience actions. So, so now that I'm outside of federal government, I do see more clearly, though it's no big surprise. I do see more clearly that adaptation and resilience are not necessarily well understood concepts. And even where there may be talk of resilience, it's not always well defined. And in fact, I asked someone recently. I used the way I asked it was, does it ever appear as a separate column on a spreadsheet? The answer was no, not yet, but maybe it's getting there. For example, there are there are there are a few metrics for resilience in any quantitative sense, and it seems to often be something that is mentioned as one of the justifications for an environmental action or a quote kind of sustainable action, but usually left somewhat vague. We were talking about my students. My students are learning or learned about climate adaptation resilience for the first time, along with everything else about climate change we talked about. And in the classroom setting, I don't think there was anything particularly challenging for students to grasp and understand. I think they got it right away. But in kind of my LLC world, I am seeing the challenge that even though there's a lot of talk of resilience, there seems to be a lot of interest in resilience. It's still um, it's still poorly defined in a sense, and again, that's not a fatal flaw because obviously things are happening and activities are happening that are leading to greater resilience. But I do think we have some work to do to um, make more of, say, a business case for resilience to make it more investable. And one of the ways I think we can do that is by working to develop um, more clear and quantitative, where possible, metrics for resilience. And that has been one of this has been one of the things I see now that I'm outside of government, and in fact it is something I'm kind of honing in on because I do think there would be broad interest in using improved metrics of resilience.
That's fascinating, Ben. I mean, I really like your when Ashley announced you earlier on the podcast and she talked about the depth and breadth of your experience. I mean, you really are an expert in this field, and I really have an appreciation for some of the finer details that you're sharing with us today. Um, Transitioning to, I think, a topic that is have been somewhat been pushed to the background recently, but it's something that's truly important and kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is environmental justice and kind of the identity and community aspect. Um, so, Ben, you teach environmental science at Howard, an institution with a deep legacy of justice and community leadership. How do your students connect environmental issues to identity, culture, or place?
Yeah, great question. Well, I've taught one course at Howard University so far. Like I said, just finishing it up. The undergraduate class on global climate change. Um, and I'll just say something about the class itself. So I intentionally provided kind of a sweeping overview class of everything from A to Z on climate change. Starting with basic foundational science on past climatic changes and the climate system and everything from sources of greenhouse gas emissions to climate models to future projections to risks and impacts, emission mitigation options, Paris Agreement, adaptation, and then we even ended with a class on geoengineering. So really A to Z. So though the course was not focused on environmental justice, throughout, given all the topics we were covering, still there were, of course, parts of the climate change issue where we did discuss, for example, how risks associated with climate change are not uniform, even, um, certainly not uniform within the United States, not uniform across the globe. Um, that others already are facing or are expected to face greater risks than others, depending on their socioeconomic status or simply location, and also how responses to climate change, whether on the emissions mitigation side or the adaptation side, may not always be equitable if these issues um, are not taken into account. How different groups are affected. And I think the students get it. And for some of my students, I think it is these kind of issues that made the climate change problem for them more real and less textbook like. I think they strongly identify with the idea that environmental burdens stem from decisions made somewhere in some place, and perhaps people like them, perhaps low income communities were not part of those decisions. But now, say Black people, all people burdened by environmental harm and climate change risks, really need to be at the table when it comes time for solutions. And I think that's an idea that is kind of um, energizing for the students. I think they intuitively get that. Um, and a tangible example is the fact that greenhouse gas emission sources share the same sources as traditional forms of air pollutants, and often those large emission sources are located close to low income and or Black neighborhoods, like um, very heavy transportation corridors or heavy industry in, say, parts of Louisiana, something we were just talking about in class the other day. So, so in these cases, addressing greenhouse gas emissions also means generating a lot of co-benefits at the very local level because of the co-emissions with other air pollutants. And I think that's a really, really important point for climate policy writ large is, there's a lot of people in the climate world who um, often operate at the national level, or they talk about international negotiations and policies. But there really is a very important local aspect of greenhouse gas emission reduction policy, but also, of course, adaptation resilience policy. The local implications can be quite large, especially if the sources of greenhouse gas um, emissions are also tied to um, um, local sources of traditional pollutants, non-greenhouse gases that have been causing, environmental burdens for years. So, um, the local benefits of greenhouse gas climate policy can actually be quite large, and that's something where it's you can tap into another community and kind of to help you build a coalition, to have greater stakeholder engagement for some actions you want to take.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm happy to hear that you're helping to cultivate, a culture of resilience and this new generation that we're raising. And I think that you're doing an outstanding job. I think where you're at, right? You're helping lead from where you're at, and that's impressive.
Um, I think your answer was great, Ben, because, we always hear all the time politics is local, disasters are local. But I think you kind of touched on the fact that community action or action is local, and
Mm.
building that future generation that's at Howard now, but that's going to go back to a bunch of different communities across the country and the world and take that local action. Building it there is amazing.
Yeah.
Um, so, I kind of want to wrap us up here and, go back to the fact that we're closing out Earth Month. I think Earth Month was started and certainly celebrated as a moment for recommitment. And I just want to sort of ask you, what's one thing you hope as we're recommitting that our listeners and communities will start or stop or continue doing going forward?
Um, well, one thing is, I think, check out what your community, what your elected representatives are doing to support clean energy and a climate resilient community. And actually, a lot can be found out pretty quickly with with all the resources and internet accessibility we have today. But that's certainly one thing.
I love that because community is about accountability. So this is a good answer.
Benjamin, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insight on such an important and timely topic. Climate resilience is it's not easy for everybody to understand. And I think you really broke it down in a way that really helped everyone kind of digest that. To everyone listening, whether you're in government, emergency management, business continuity, infrastructure, or simply someone who cares about the future of your community, climate resilience is everyone's responsibility. The work starts now with better conversations, smarter decisions, and stronger collaboration. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today on the Road to Resilience podcast. I'm John Ray.
And I'm Ashley here again.
Stay informed, stay connected, and stay resilient.